For a Wednesday night at conference. By this time everybody's usually absolutely exhausted and is either going to a disco or asleep rather than to a fringe meeting. So I'm not sure that Joe and I can promise you a disco, but we'll do our very best to keep you awake. I'm really pleased that ResPublica has organised this meeting, because I think that the Public Services Social Value Act, as it is now, is actually going to be very important in the months and years to come. If we handle it properly, and I think that's quite a big if for me. I was quite instrumental, together with Chris White, in taking the bill through Parliament last year, because he came quite high up in the private members' ballot, and he was a new member, so he came to see me and said, Hazel, you know, you were kind of talking about all this stuff when you were Secretary of State for Communities, you've always been involved in this area, will you help? And my view is that this is a cross-party issue, and therefore I was, you know, delighted to try and help steer that bill through Parliament. The path of private members' bills is rocky, difficult. You often need kind of one awkward member of Parliament to shout object, and the whole of your bill will fall. So it was a matter really of shepherding it through. But in that process, it was absolutely fascinating, because it was only a 5-clause bill. I like to say, like me and Chris, who is also about 4'11" tall, it was small but perfectly formed. So it was a great bill. But when it was first promoted, it was very much about social enterprise. It talked about having a national social enterprise strategy, for local authorities to have a social enterprise strategy, and the government, you could see from day one, were utterly opposed to that. So as it went through its process, it actually got a bit mangled and, I would say, eviscerated by the government, and it's now a 3-clause act. I still think that it has the potential to be transformational. But what was really interesting in the second reading of the bill, which went on for several hours in the House, is that there were a group of new Tories who I would describe as very much on the libertarian wing of the party. And they spent a long time, almost in a kind of Oxford debating club style, in arguing that this bill was kind of anti-liberty, that it would put fetters and constraints on the market, because it was requiring local authorities and other agencies to take into account social, economic and environmental well-being, rather than simply concentrating on the bottom line, profit, pure naked capitalism, which is absolutely where they want the market to be. And what that illustrated for me was something that I've long believed about this coalition, and that is that there is a political schism on this agenda in the government. You've got people like Nick Hurd, who I genuinely think believes this is something. It is committed to civil society, wants to see, if you like, the weight of procurement being used to make a social difference. But then you've got people like Francis Maud, who, with the greatest respect to Nick Hurd, is a bigger hitter within the government. And I believe that the work he's doing in the Cabinet Office around open public services, around opening up our public services to more competition, actually is a much more traditional right-wing agenda, which is about basically bringing in the very large organisations, the Capitals, the Sercos, those people, in order to transfer public services into the private sector. They know that's controversial, that wing of the party, and therefore, you know, I'm not a cynic. I'm really not a cynic. If anything, I'm very idealistic. But there's a bit of me thinks that they want to use the social enterprise, voluntary sector, community sector brand as a safe halfway house on the road to privatisation, and that we will, you know, we'll move our kind of public services into the safe haven of social enterprise. That then will be so undercapitalised that it won't be able to carry the risk of providing major public services. The social enterprise sector, you know, because it's quite a nascent sector, won't have that kind of resilience. And then the big companies will have to come in and say, well, we'll have to rescue it for you, and therefore then you've got your transition. Now, I don't believe that the social enterprise sector is that safe haven. I think the social enterprise sector, the voluntary sector, you know, the not-for-profit sector can be a really, really powerful force for innovation, creativity, and actually should be playing a bigger role in the provision of our public services. But what I don't like is this kind of sham idea that it's a halfway stopping point to where actually the right wing of the Tory party wants to get to. And I think that they've got a kind of quite a sinister plan around some of this. And if you look at the way that the work programme has actually worked out in practice, you know, when they started off on the work programme, they said that the prime contractors, the big boys, would only get the contracts if they came hand in hand with social enterprises, small voluntary organisations who could reach out to the community and who could innovate and be creative. And actually what's happened in practice is that those small organisations have not had the resilience to be able to conduct those kind of contracts. And what's trickled down from the big prime contractors has been virtually nothing. And certainly in this area in the northwest, we've got 3 big prime contractors, none of whom are based in the northwest. And every voluntary organisation here will tell you that actually that was a sham. So I think we've already got evidence about where that will go to. Having said that, I still think that we should try and make the most of the act that we've got. It is an opportunity for us to shift public procurement. And it takes me back a little bit to contract compliance. Those of us who are old enough to remember that in the kind of late 80s, we tried to go down this path before when we used contracting and procurement to try and get social value. Margaret Thatcher stamped on that, basically said it was illegal and unlawful. At that time, I was a lawyer in this building, probably in this very committee room. I was advising Graham Stringer and then Labour Council that if they went down this path, they'd probably go to jail. So it's kind of come full circle. And I think what we've got probably in this Act, to some extent, is what we wanted to get in the 80s, but maybe it's contract compliance light as to where we are. And I think the job of all of us who see the value in using procurement to get local jobs, to get apprenticeships, to get training, to get a local supply chain, to do things that really add value to the community, is to be quite clever about how we use this. Because my worry is that the words in the Act are simply that local authorities must consider social and economic and environmental well-being. Not that they have to do it. So they can say, well, we considered it and decided not to do it. I think the wording is really quite weak. If they put take account of, that would have been a harder position without even making it a duty, because that has a legal definition and you could really push with that. So we've only got consider. So we've got to be clever about how we use it. But I think that it can make, actually, having all those reservations, I think it can make a huge difference. I only have to look around in this area, in my constituency in Manchester, when we were doing Media City, we actually put conditions in all of our contracts about local labour, about local supply chains, and we actually got double the number of local jobs than they got when they constructed the Olympic Park. Media City was twice as successful in promoting that kind of local labour. And we went out on a limb in that contracting process. We took a risk that some of that could have been challenged. Luckily it wasn't, and it made a big difference. I also think that this Act can expand the vision of social value from beyond, if you like, the public sector and the third sector, which is where we traditionally would put it. We'd say those organisations want to do public good, but I think that we should be using this Act to move it also into the private sector and to say to the private sector, look, if you want to get contracts from public authorities, you are going to have to consider what is your added value to that sense of community good. And I think if you take this, together with all the work that we've now got running, and I think there's a change in the atmosphere around responsible capitalism, you start to see 2 things coming together in that there are a number of companies now, big companies, small companies, who recognise that just doing traditional capitalism is not only morally the right thing to do, but actually is not good for business. That there is a real business case in getting local labour, in training your own apprentices, and getting them to come through your company. You look at the German business model, and I know the previous meeting had Maurice Glassman in, and Maurice has done a lot of work around this. You look at the German business model, which is about being rooted in your community. It's about having long-term ownership of companies into several generations, many of them family-owned. It's about having a real commitment to training your own workforce, bringing them through, not discarding them when they've done their apprenticeship, but employing them within your company. And you can see that German idea of a long-term commitment to your community actually makes businesses more successful. And I think that argument now is beginning to take root. So if you put this Public Services Social Value Act together with the move towards a more responsible capitalism, companies committing to work in their communities and to have social value, I think you start to get a picture of something that is really important and optimistic. My only caveat would be is that I think that probably in Labour local authorities, we will all push this as hard as we possibly can. I certainly will be with my council, and Labour MPs will be as well. I am not sure it will be as well taken up in those areas who do not have champions and who want to make this happen. And my worry is that the voluntary organisations, the social enterprises, the people who want to do this, will be almost at the door, kind of waving the Public Services Act. But our procurement people, both nationally and locally, are so traditionally conservative and unimaginative that I worry that we won't have the transformational effect that we want to see happen. So I think the responsibility on all of us is almost to have an action plan now going forward with this Act. What are we going to do, whether it's as MPs, as local councillors, as people in the sector, to actually make this work, John? I know that NAVCA will be pushing this along, but I think if we can get our act together, if we can get coordinated on this, we could actually see some incredible change here. And if we think that we've now got 1 million young people who are out of work, a complete lost generation, then the prospect of using procurement and contracting to be able to make sure that some of those young people at least have the chance of a future, I think will make a huge difference. And I would just finally leave you with one example in my own constituency, which has been inspirational for me. We have a small construction company called B for Box, which is run by a woman entrepreneur, very rare in construction, and she's been going now for just 3 years. And she takes on young people who've had the most terrible backgrounds you can imagine, from homelessness to drug addiction, dysfunctional families, terrible circumstances. She brings them through a training programme, not just to level 2, not just apprenticeships, but level 2, level 3. She's got one young man at level 4 who's now supervising a whole construction site, and it has absolutely changed their lives. She has fought tooth and nail through what's called the JCT building contract, which only allows you to award contracts on the basis of being on time, on price, and on the quality of the goods that you produce. It has no room for manoeuvre in that JCT building contract, which regulates the whole of the construction industry for social value. Now, we've drafted some clauses between us with a helpful lawyer as well, and we've been to government, we've been to NICHA and said, look, if you really mean this, then the contracting documents that apply to our big major sectors of industry have got to allow for us to be able to adopt the tender that isn't simply about price and being on time, but it is about adopting those contracts that have this social value. Because what Aileen MacDonald is doing in B for Box is not only changing those people's lives, but if they weren't involved in her company and doing the work they're doing, I have no doubt that some of them would still be offending, some of them would still be involved with drugs and alcohol and all the problems that causes. So she's actually saving our community an absolute fortune, and it makes sense. But I still think that we have an awfully big job on our hands to make sure that this tiny but perfectly formed bill makes the kind of massive difference that all of us want to see.
Hazel, and welcome Gareth to the panel. Gareth is the Shadow Minister for Civil Society, and if he doesn't mind, I might pass straight over to him.
I'll step into the breach. Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. I suppose you should start a speech after yesterday's, review of performance by Miliband by saying, "Where's my speech?" And I know you said that yesterday, but it's not original, because I used to work for John Prescott at one time, and I remember him beginning a speech down in Portsmouth, and he said, "Where's my speech?" But in that case, it meant he'd left it in the gents' toilet. So, not quite the same thing. It was true. Thanks very much for coming tonight, and really pleased such a good turnout. I'm Joe Irvin. I'm now Chief Executive of NAVCA, which isn't a discount retail chain. It's the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action, and what we do is we represent the local charitable sector, if you like, local voluntary and community sector, and our members are the umbrella groups in local authorities, usually Council of Voluntary Service and such organisations who help local charities. So we have about 400 members, but they in turn support 160,000 local community and voluntary groups, and that's our focus really, is on the local voluntary and community action. And I want to just cover 3 points tonight really. One is about the role of the voluntary community side of things, third sector, civil society, that side of things. Second, to just touch on this specific bill, which Hazel's really gone through, so I won't repeat what she said, but just make a few points about it. And third, to talk about where Labour is in all this. Now, I'm CEO of a charity, we're not party political, but we do have campaigning views and we do have views about things, so I feel it's suitable that we make those points. So the first part of this, one of the things that really gets my goat is, I heard the Prime Minister say in the lead up to the Paralympics, and he said, that it's been so great at the Paralympics and the Olympics and all these volunteers who've taken part, and there's so many people who talk down our society. And I thought, yeah, it was you, wasn't it? And really, broken society is the one I'm on about. That really gets my goat. And the reason why is because it gives a counsel of despair. And I think that, of course, there are lots of problems, but do you realise that a quarter of all adults volunteer on a monthly basis, formally? That's 13 million people. And I've just been down today. Two things I've done today. One is I went up to Salford, to your patch, and there's an organisation called BINO, which is Orthodox Jewish organisation, which is a charitable organisation which supports also, and they're doing fantastic work there, and probably opened my eyes, I have to say. The average number of children in a household in that community is 8. There are all sorts of issues of poverty that I never really realised, but the amount of goodwill people put into that to support their own community is absolutely fantastic. And the other thing is I came back and I stood on the side where the funeral procession for Nicola Hughes, police constable who was killed, was there, and I thought how horrible that was when that happened. And that's when you start thinking about broken society. And then I saw the streets absolutely lined with people of Manchester, to pay tribute. So, for every bit of bad there's this massive goodwill to deal with it. So two things you get from that: big problems to deal with, and I'm not playing that down at all, and many of the problems are getting worse. But there is a fantastic, good sense of community in this country which is prepared to get rid of it, and we should tap into. That's my first point. Moving on to the social value and the social value bill. I think it's great that Chris White and Hazel was very influential. She mentioned her role, but she was very influential in getting that through. And it got cross-party support, and it means that from April there'll be an obligation on local authorities and other procurement bodies, if you like, commissioning bodies, to take account of the social value. Now, a confusing thing about this is sometimes commissioners will think, we're commissioning, say, to get a certain result in supporting children. That's a social value. But actually, social value is about the value you're getting over and above what you specify in the contract. So it's about the extra things that you bring. And I just first of all, before I want to talk about the definition of that, talk about commissioning. So I find we've got a great problem with commissioning and procurement. Hazel said how really conservative with a small c, let's say that, including lawyers, some of your successors who are in that field are, and they think everything's got to go in the European Journal and you've got to make everything, massive, complicated contract, and that's far from the case actually. They make it more difficult than it needs to be. So the first thing I'll say is commissioning does not equal procurement. So you can decide to commission some work if you're a local council. You can decide, after considering it, that you're going to provide it yourself. So you don't have to that doesn't necessarily lead to procurement. If you decide to procure, which is to go out and get someone else to provide that service, it doesn't necessarily equal a payment by results contract. And sometimes that's a very onerous way. I've had talks to the National Audit Office, and they've said there are many local authorities especially that are creating great onerous contracting bids and monitoring procedures for quite small sums, where they'd be better off saying, we're going to have a grant, you can apply for the grant, you can compete for it, and this is what we want from the grant, without having a great paraphernalia of that. So it's got to be proportionate. And the third thing I'd say is the big problem, which Hazel referred to, is we have, I don't know what it is now, £240 billion, biz say, of public procurement in this country, £240 billion of public procurement still, despite cuts. And it's extremely difficult for small businesses, small enterprises, social enterprises, or smaller charities, even some larger charities, to even get a look in on that, whereas it could be made a lot easier. And we've worked with the Local Government Association, who produced a procurement pledge, on how, one of the parts of which is how to make it much easier, how to engage with small business and social enterprise and voluntary organisations, to give them a look in and perhaps be able to add a bit more. Now, the extra part of this bill, which is adding the social value, again, you could a lot of people think of it in a very complicated way, and what I think is there is not a ready reckoner of this is a social value, here's the number of pounds it's worth. You know, keep someone out of jail for 20 years, it's worth X amount. You can do that calculation, but the more you try and go down that road, the more actual difficult it is. Many of these things are quite intangible, and it would also be immensely calculated if you thought of every piece of social value you could get to consider when you're doing commission procurement. So I would say it's more like a process. And I think if anybody's here, perhaps a local councillor or involved in a council, or talking to councils on how they do it, then I think it's a process, and it's about thinking about what are the really important social values you have. You can have a different one from another local authority somewhere else, but I think the important thing is to engage with your community through community groups and otherwise to say these are the things that really are important to us. And they might be things like community engagement. So you'll have two contracts which are fairly similar, but you'll get community engagement from one. You're allowed to prefer that one. It might be more apprenticeships. It might be taking local people out of work and getting them into work. These are all things that you can. It might be engagement, a number of volunteers that you get engaged in something. These are all social values which you are permitted under this law to take into account. So don't make it too complicated. Think of it as a process. Engage people in that. And I'd say, which Hazel said as well, really, just to echo that, it won't in itself, being an Act of Parliament, mean that it's magically going to happen everywhere. It leaves a lot of discretion, it leaves a lot of thought for commissioning bodies. And I think we've all got to work at that to get a culture change. Culture change among commissioners, among councillors, and probably in the voluntary and community sector as well, as to how we set about this. So I think we, as voluntary organisations, have got to be more kind of savvy, if you like, of proving that we're having an impact and showing local authorities if you want support to do that. And I think local authorities and commissioners have got to be more flexible and imaginative about thinking through the social value that can be brought in through contracts. So I'll move on from that now, and obviously there'll be more to say and I'll answer questions, but I'll just finally talk then about labour and social value and the wider voluntary and community sector. I mean, I think that that Labour in government had quite a good relationship with voluntary organisations, with the organisations. I think in government, and I was there for a while, it's very easy to forget about communities and the more local level. Hazel, I have to say, is an actual exception to all this, because she was battling for this all through. But it's very easy to just forget that and think about you're pulling levers and maybe this will work, but not think through. And I think there's more realisation that communities matter and what happens in communities matter. It probably was always perhaps stronger among local councillors than it was among the kind of national tier. And I think, and this is a bit of a controversial thing and a challenging thing to say, I think when the Tories came along with the idea of big society, it put Labour on the back foot a bit. And people thought, well, how do we respond to this? This was an area that people thought was naturally Labour territory. I think the real truth was Labour was very supportive of voluntary organisations, probably a bit disengaged, as all parties were, from communities and community action, but trying to get there. And how do you respond to that? Well, you can respond by saying big society is a terrible idea. And if it is a cover for cuts and privatisation, if big society, big society should not mean pulling away support and leaving people to fend for themselves. It should not mean that. But I actually think the Tories were onto something when they thought big society, because they were chiming with something the public thought, which is about communities, about the way people came together down Deansgate today, about the way people came out. The horrible thing that when April Jones disappeared in mid-Wales, a terrible thing to happen to you, then, again, a broken society moment. But hundreds of people went to volunteer to search through the night. Nobody paid them. They weren't getting anything for it. The community rallied round, and you see that. So I think they were kind of onto that sort of idea. So if it means taking away support, if it means leaving people to fend for themselves, that's bad. But I think Labour has yet to come up with a viable alternative to big society, an explanation of that. and really digging into what could be there. And I think, you know, people are working on that. I know Gareth's working on that, but it's still really to come out something of that nature. And I think what that has to achieve is a really appreciating the value of what communities bring. I think we've got such big challenges, and this isn't just about austerity, big demographic change, social care, all those things, big challenges that actually the state is not going to be able to solve on its own, and probably never was able to. And we're going to have the public sector, the private sector, and the voluntary sector all working in some way to try and achieve ends and make things reasonable within whatever resources we have, even if we had a lot more resources. So I think that's all going to have to happen. And I think plugging into what's happening and I would call social assets, and that's people, it's relationships, it's networks, it's the stuff I was seeing in Salford earlier today. Sometimes it's buildings where people come together. You know, we've got to appreciate that and nurture it. And where societies are falling apart a bit, that's when they need those sorts of things bolstering, community leaders coming forward and all that sort of thing. So I think that's the sort of area we need to get to. And I would just say finally that I think, you know, this should be the natural territory of Labour, actually. You know, Labour was founded out of community groups. It was founded out of cooperators, the people, even trade unions, who were people who came together freely to form associations. It wasn't a top-down organisation. So it should be an area that Labour's comfortable with. And I also think it probably chimes with, if I want to make it, give it an Ed Miliband zest, pre-distribution, and which everybody knows what that means. But so pre-distribution meaning trying to get a fairer society before you get to the tax system, if you can put it that way. And I think there are three elements of this which really chime well. One is getting companies and institutions to act in the public interest. So I'll give the example of that. It's the Living Wage campaign, which really was a bottom-up community-led campaign when it started off, and we've been big supporters of that. Secondly, early intervention, so that if you address a question early, particularly, let's say, you know, helping mothers with young children who've got difficulties, you're going to save a lot of really bad effects that are going to come later, which are bad socially, but are also costly to the state and to everybody else. And the third thing is that community action can be a bulwark against big power. I think that's a very big part of this. And I just want to quote for you from Jacob Hacker, who some of you may have seen. Did you see Jacob Hacker, the American professor? Yeah, so he said, I'll just preface this, he talks about middle-class democracy, but you have to understand in America, over 95% of people regard themselves as middle class. So he says middle-class democracy, which means ordinary people's democracy, rested on organisations such as unions and cross-class civic organisations that gave middle-class voters knowledge about what was at stake in policy debates, as well as political leverage to influence those debates. So I think building a strong society and strong communities is also actually doing a good cause for democracy. So I'll leave it there. I'll leave you to that challenge and those thoughts about the Social Value Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and sorry for pestering you until
That's all right.
Please do.
Okay. Thanks very much to ResPublica for the opportunity to join you this evening. Great to see so many people here. I know I'm not the draw this evening because I was the poor substitute earlier on today, so it must be Hazel or this man here. But great to see such an interest in how we use the social value legislation that's gone through Parliament and take that forward to try and expand the social enterprise movement. To I hope, help us to create the sort of good society, again, that we all, I suspect, believe in. When I think of social enterprise, Hazel gave you the example that motivates her in some of her work from her constituency. I think of a London social enterprise called Hackney Community Transport, which has the contract for providing a whole series of the major bus services in North London, and indeed in a series of across a series of London boroughs well outside Hackney. Started off as a very small social enterprise, but what it has done is that won successfully contracts from Transport for London. And instead of having to pay a dividend to a private equity firm that might own it, what it does instead is to provide free transport services to local community clubs for people who wouldn't otherwise get out of their homes and mix with people in a way that they have traditionally in their lives done before. So here you have a vibrant, effective commercial business using the surplus that it generates for a hugely important social return in terms of helping people in that community who would otherwise be isolated actually have the chance to mix with other people. The beauty of social enterprise and potentially of social value legislation is that it gives local authorities and potentially national government the chance to expand the examples of, Hazel, I think you said it was B-Box, or in the example I give you, Hackney Community Transport, far more so that more communities can benefit from social enterprise. Even if it's apprenticeships or it's jobs, in the times that we're in at the moment, we need to make sure that we're getting more value out of the contracts that public services offer. The context, perhaps, for the discussion we're having tonight is particularly important now than in previous years in terms of the benefit that social enterprises and community organisations might get through the use of this legislation. The National Council for Voluntary Organisations say that about £3 billion of government funding that would otherwise have gone to the voluntary and community sector will be lost to the sector by 2015. We are already seeing a large number of small community charities shutting their doors, closing down services, some having to merge with other organisations, and doing so at a time usually when the demand for their services has never been so great. So by the time we come back to power in 2015, the challenge for us is to recognise now that we're not going to be able to put that £3 billion back into the sector in its entirety. And we actually have to think in more imaginative ways about new sources of finance for the third sector. One of them, certainly, it seems to me, is to try and look at the sort of fledgling social investment models that are beginning to develop. Some of you will be aware of the social impact bonds that are being looked at and explored, particularly in the context of Peterborough Prison, trying to create solutions to one of the big challenges we have, reducing reoffending rates from prisons, using the third sector and providing clear social value from the contract that is offered. One of the things that we have done as a party in policy terms so far is to look at another form of social investment, working with the financial services industry to say that the banks have to be much more open about what they lend and where they lend it, that there has to be an obligation on banks that they have to lend into every community, and where they don't want to lend into every community themselves, then they've got to work with community banks, with charities, with credit unions, with cooperatives, and in that way get lending into communities. Now, where that's happened in other countries, for example in the United States of America, it has helped to see $7 trillion of investment, social investment, not government funding, into deprived communities over the last 40 years. And that's gone into social enterprise. It's helped to create jobs. It's helped to create low-cost financing. If it's been done in the US, then it can certainly be done here in the UK. We've had a positive reaction to that. But I think potentially that the social value bill, I'm looking at the screen now, I don't know why I'm looking at the screen next, it's just got tweets on it. Disintegrating tweets. But the social value legislation, if we can persuade government, as Hazel said, to actually go out to local authorities and all those who do the contracting work and encourage them and persuade them to adopt the social value legislation, then there is a huge potential to get a better return to the communities in which we all live from the public services contracting that there is at the moment. doesn't yet feel as though the government, through the Cabinet Office, are actually trying to train commissioners in the use of this social value tool. There are a series of isolated examples already. Co-op councils, for example, like Lambeth Council, that have seized on this initiative, this legislation, and are already remodelling the way in which they do their contracts at a very local level. The government has set up a commissioning academy, in principle a very good thing, but the people going through that commissioning academy, as I understand it, are not being trained in the use of this legislation. So there is potentially a huge missed opportunity in that sense. What we don't yet know clearly is where we'll be in 2015, but we are going to have to, as a party, look at new ways of maximising the return to individual communities from the contracts that are issued, and new ways to encourage more social enterprises to forward. It seems to me one of the most obvious ways in which we can get more money into the third sector and ensure that that money works for the communities in a far more effective way than perhaps some of the traditional contracting has done in the past. So we've set out one area of new sources of financing in terms of social investment just recently in August. Our open banking paper adopting this American piece of legislation which could work in the UK and make a difference. We need to look at new sources of social investment too, and also what else we can do to maximise the social value from public services contracting. That work is beginning, but I mean I see the opportunity of this fringe meeting as the chance to begin a further discussion with the Labour Party members directly about how we go about that in the future. Thanks very much.
For the panellists to respond to one another before we go out to questions, and this need only be just very quick. And Hazel, I was very taken by your kind of application of social value to the private markets as well. And in your response, I wondered whether to take my opportunity as chair to ask how you would go about prompting that further in, say, energy markets.
I say that because the last year I've been convening a round table of some quite big corporates, people like Morrison Supermarkets, Dexo, people like that, together with social enterprises and voluntary organisations to get them talking about how they can work together. And I won't say directly about energy markets just now, but I would just say Gareth, around the social impact bonds, right? This was heralded as something that could really be transformational. I personally think that it's got caught up in the usual civil service kind of morass. And I think the social impact bond is over-engineered, it's over-complicated, it's over-bureaucratic, and therefore it isn't going to scale. And I've been working with Sodexo, who run prisons. And they said to me, rather than have a payment by results and a social impact bond and all of that, they've got so fed up with trying to find their way through it, they said, well, we're a massive organisation, we employ 40,000 people, we want to commit to taking 400 young people who've been offenders directly into our business, right? And that way you get, 10 times the results. You don't have to go through a process of drawing investment from social impact bonds. I'm not saying that they're not appropriate, but if you can mobilise the private sector, actually it has the ability to make quick decisions. It doesn't have to go through all the stuff that government has to go through. Its board decides it's going to take on 400 young people in the next 12 months. It can do it. And therefore I think that there's a real bonus in mobilising the private sector on this, and then and for them to see the bottom line in terms of bringing those young people through their organisation. It may well be that some of those young people end up working back in the prisons. I don't necessarily think that's the best role for them. I'd want to find them something else in the Sodexo empire for them to do rather than necessarily go back to prison. But I think that there is I have been quite inspired by some of these companies that, when I met them, I'd be very sceptical. I think, that you're basically capitalist, you've got your bottom line, you want to maximise your profits, you don't really get this. And yet we had Asda at a conference this week talking about their community footprint, using their facilities for community groups, and they recognise that if you are active in the community, all their research is that 70% of people will be more loyal to your brand if they know that you're doing things locally in their community. So you're making a business case for them at the same time. I think this agenda has suffered because it's been seen as a nice thing to do, an add-on, something that we can afford in the good times, but actually when times are tough, these are the kind of things that go by the wayside. If you can make a business case for them and make them integral to the way a company runs its business model, you have a far better chance of getting them to be sustainable. And I would just say that in response to Joe, I couldn't agree more with you, Joe, that we did not make progress on this in the way that I would like to have seen us do in government. And that is because there's always been in the Labour Party a tension between the Fabian wing of middle-class people doing good things for poor people and actually our community basis, which is where we come from, which is working-class people doing things for themselves, provided you give them the backup and the power to make a difference in their own lives. I know very firmly which wing of the party I'm on, and I'm only sorry that in government we didn't have the kind of backing. And when David Cameron came in and he did Big Society, I felt so angry because he basically stole our clothes and he stole our principles. And he did it for a cynical reason, I believe, because in the two words, Big Society, because he's a branding man, isn't he? He's a PR man, basically. And in those words, we talked about community empowerment and to motivate everybody. In Big Society, he managed to say that you could have a small estate, right? But there was such a thing as society. So he basically got rid of the Thatcher idea that there was no such thing as society, and he said, there is society, it's just not the same as the state. So you could have a small state, a big society, and still look compassionate. It was a fabulous bit of branding and a way of encapsulating what actually we know is that ordinary people want to come together. They want their government to be on their side, and they are prepared to do their bit, provided we try and make it reasonably easy for them to do so. And we missed some of that. We were overcomplicated, and we were still bound up in this idea that if we announced a £150 million national programme, then we'd have pilots and we'd roll it out over the state like some kind of dough that you would roll out over the country. Then that would do the trick, and it didn't. And we missed that energy and that vibrancy of ordinary people to change their own lives.
Well, I'll just say a few words about that. I think where Cameron did get it right with the Big Society, where he went wrong is that, because I think if you ask people in the street, loads of them would recognise that phrase, and none of them would recognise redistribution or most of the other phrases which are in the political surface. Not that they're bad things, I'm just saying you cut through, and people got an idea of it, and they liked it at the time. Why they got fed up with it was the government doing things which contradicted it. That's what gets people's noses. It's not they think about Big Society as a bad thing, it's when it's been used for a cover to make cuts and all those other things. What I say, I mean, if you're talking about tensions in the Labour Party, probably shouldn't get too much into this, but there is that tension between the Fabian, going out suit with big hats and community working class organisation and middle class organisation, let's face it, but self-organisation. But there's also a tension, let's face it as well, between we've got to provide everything, whether we're the local council or the state, and unions backing that, and I'm from that exactly that wing, but doing that too much. And I've got an aunt by marriage actually, who was in the very early days of what was then called the Spastic Society, and she got involved because of families who were of children who had cerebral palsy. They weren't being ignored by the National Health Service and the state, but they were being isolated and put in their own separate schools and facilities not allowed to fit, and so they really were treated in a very poor way. And the Spastic Society, which now became Scope, thank goodness, is now a big organisation, started off very small, but what it's mainly done is to try and get people to be responsive to the needs of children and others with cerebral palsy. And she actually got in terrible trouble because she was doing job placement for teenagers with cerebral palsy, and she found a lot of the problems when she talked to people where they were trying to deal with puberty and sexuality on top of all this, after being put in these separate schools and treated separate from society, and a lot of their angst was about this, and it's quite natural when you think about it, isn't it? So she said we should arrange some tea parties, kind of little dances and things where people can get to meet each other. And I can't remember which newspaper it was now, but I think it was the Daily Mail, and it said the headline, no, but it might have been the Sun actually, the Sun, and it said spinster promotes sex for spastics, and that was the response to it. And that's what they had to put up against to do all this. The fact is that both in society at the time, and that was the social attitude that they could put into, she and others from quite a small organisation had to fight against that, and really had to fight the health service and had to fight local authorities and others who weren't wanting to be bad, but really didn't take into account the needs of young people. And I think actually voluntary organisations and community groups are so much better at being flexible, and so we need to find the right balance between those. I'm not for replacing core public services with volunteers, I don't believe in that, but I think we've got to increasingly work together to get the right balance between those things.
Thank you, Joe. And Gareth, did you just want to add a couple of words?
Just very briefly, I think the point that Hazel makes about the need to essentially to get a clearer and more effective partnership between the three different sectors in our country, public, private and third sector, is absolutely right. You know, given the challenges that we face, not only in terms of the levels of money that are going to be available to a new administration in 2015, and given the other challenges that the country faces, the ageing population, the need to adjust to the huge technological changes that are taking place, climate change, etc. You know, we are going to have to think through what are the different triggers that we need to deploy, be it in more effective regulation, be it in terms of the use of the money that we have available, to get more effective action in our communities, get people into work, make sure we're maximising the value from the services that we want to be provided in the future. And that is an extremely complex piece of work that is going to be required across the party to achieve that. I think the social value legislation points us in a direction that potentially is a sort of a key way through all of that. But what is clear is the government certainly not maximising the opportunities of the legislation at the moment, and our challenge will be to try and put that right.
Thank you, Gareth. It's really encouraging actually to have a conversation about the wider social economy, because there is, we have found a bit of a danger of narrowing social value as a particular add-on, as Hazel said. So I'm going to open up to a number of questions. I'll take them in groups of three and then direct them to the panel. Gentleman at the front, lady in the second row, and then gentleman second to the back.
Yeah, I've just got a question for, I suppose, for Hazel about procurement and risk, because sometimes the pieces of legislation, like
I can't hear you. Could you speak?
Sorry, the quality contracts that the government introduced for bus services, which no councils really have the guts to kind of really try because of the risk of it being judicially reviewed. I was just wondering what kind of insurance and legal processes there are to make sure that kind of councils manage that risk, and whether they can socialise that risk by kind of getting together and kind of like say if one council is going to try something out which is going to be quite risky, whether they can all chip in to make sure that, you know, if that sets a precedent which all the other councils can copy and they'll benefit from it, that they also pay for the risk.
Thank you. Yes, yeah.
I'm Helen O'Hara, I'm a councillor from Oxford East, and I also, as a councillor...
Could you speak up? I can't hear you at all.
Sorry, I've got a very low voice. I'm a councillor from Oxford East, and I also, as a happen to work in children's services, although obviously I'm not representing a profession or anything like that here. I was interested in what you were saying there, Joe, about the difference of vision that you get when you're in the voluntary sector. And I think that can be true. I've worked myself in the voluntary sector, I've worked in the prison, I've worked in a homeless hostel, and I've been in statutory services for about 10 years now. You know, there are differences and there are different contributions. What I'm finding is that there are lots of discussions about the mix of services, but no social work expertise on panels, or none that people are admitting to. I did see one panel where there was someone who had been a social worker on the panel, but he didn't tell anyone. So I find that very odd. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed. It's part of the relationship with the workplace, which we're all talking about. You know, people obviously need to come into the party and be active and be in meetings and start talking. But I really think that's something that I wonder if the panel have got an idea about why that might be. Because the social workers are the leaders with very vulnerable families. They're the leaders in this mix of service. There was one point. Yeah, I wonder how people, whether there are core services that people feel will always remain statutory, or whether everything is up for grabs at this point.
Interesting, thank you. And a gentleman toward the back.
Hi, my name is Thomas Haig. I'm the delegate from Altrincham, which is just down the road. I work for a procurement company that buys things for social landlords, and as part of that we buy labour, and what we do is contractually, when we offer this pool of work, large pool of work to contractors, we say that for every £1 million that we spend with you, we want you to take on 2 apprentices, and that's been quite successful in terms of upfront incentivising private sector companies with work, which the public sector's got lots of, and then upfront, contractually tying them into particular responsibilities.
Thank you. Could I start with Joe this time, please?
Okay, well, the one that's directed to me was about social work. I mean, the second question you asked, are the core services which will always remain statutory? I believe yes. I believe that lots of them will be statutory. And you can have a statutory core service which isn't provided by the public sector as well. So it can be a statutory service that you contract people in to do. That's quite feasible to do. But I actually think I may differ from people maybe on the panel here, is that I really don't think that volunteers can go in and do all that work in a substantial way. I think the public require professionalism in many causes, and in some places there's a high risk of failure. You've got to have core public service provision. I do believe that, but I do think there are other areas where the state, local state and national state can commission other people to do work quite feasibly. I find actually there are social workers, qualified social workers in the voluntary sector. You know this, don't you? There are qualified social workers in the voluntary sector and in the state sector. And actually the difference you're pointing out is having a professional approach to social work and those who don't. And you can find that both in the state sector and in the voluntary sector. I don't know the answer to why you're finding panels that aren't taking social work seriously, but it maybe it's to do with the vilification of social workers that we have seen experienced in various times, and I think very unfairly. So it may be to do with that, but maybe it'd be interesting to, Gareth being closer to this, if Labour was in government and you were a minister, would there be a bigger push to require more social work expertise to be involved in some of these? So that's what I'd say to that.
Can I just say, it's not being talked about. It's not being mentioned.
Yeah.
That's what
what you said about somebody actually being ashamed to say almost probably underlines my guess, which is that perhaps it's a very bad side effect of the, I think, unfair vilification of social work.
Can I come to you next, Gareth, and then
Yeah, sure. Let me just pick up the. I know you wanted Hazel to answer on procurement, and let me just pick up 1 or 2 things around that question, because it seems to me that cuts to the heart of the question that exam question, if you like, that ResPublica posed for us all tonight. As I was coming in, Hazel was talking about some of the problems with the work programme and the way in which some of the voluntary and community sector organisations who were signed up by some of the big prime contractors have essentially been used as bid candy in their ideas. Amazing charities like St Mungo's who get people back in to work after they've left prison. Signed up in London in particular, but also outside of London, to provide support as part of the work programme by a number of primes, not used at all. Now, here is a charity with huge expertise in getting people with a difficult past into work, not used, not even once. And that does suggest that the way in which the contract around the work programme has been drawn up was not put together in a way that seriously thought through the issues around social value, how to maximise the skills in the voluntary and community sector in that way. And part of it does seem to me because of ministers' desire to offload the risk around contracting, providing of key services onto either the private sector or to the voluntary sector if possible. In reality, it's usually onto the private sector because the big corporate organisations can manage that risk in a way that smaller charities find it more difficult to do so. So I do think we have to rethink through how we handle those issues of risk. We do want, it seems to me, the private sector involved in the provision of services on occasion, but it seems to be too much at the moment at the exclusion of some of the expertise that exists in the third sector more generally. So we need to think through how we do that. Helen, just to answer your question, I mean, I instinctively think, of course, there will be a whole series of statutory services that are retained. The question of who provides then that statutory service seems to me that we should have a bit more of an open mind about. And it seems to me the issue for us as a party going forward is to think through what are the principles that we want to have in place, helping us to determine what services are put out to contract and which services aren't. In particular, where you're providing complex social care services, you want to make sure that written into the contract are issues around the integration and the quality of service provision. I don't necessarily share the view that that can't be provided through third sector organisations, but we need to think through how we make sure we embed those in the contracts going forward. Not an expert, I'm afraid, on where we are on social work issues, but happy to talk to you afterwards about where you might go to get a better answer than I or Joe, unless Hazel can help us out, can offer you tonight.
Thank you, Gareth. Hazel?
Yeah, just in terms of risk and local authorities, as I say, a long time ago I was the lawyer advising him here, and all of my experience has been, both in those terms and also as a minister, is that the system is, in local authorities and in national government, is risk averse. And certainly when I was a minister, as a health minister in particular, the civil servants understood the public sector, because they were used to dealing with that. They understood the private sector, because they were used to, after 20 years of Tory government, dealing with that. They didn't get at all the range and spectrum of organisations that were voluntary sector, social enterprises, not for private profit. They were totally uncomfortable with all of this. And in this whole field, I think there is a desperate need, and I think as Gareth mentioned, the Academy, for commissioning, actually to get some expertise and some confidence in the system about what you can do. Because at the moment, as soon as you start saying, well, if you go down this path, you know, you'll be against European procurement law, you'll find yourself being judicially reviewed by the unsuccessful contractors, etc., etc. What that puts into the system is a kind of panic reaction that this is all too difficult. And I think that our commissioners really do need confidence. But the difficulty is, when you have a minister who really believes this, you can shift the system. Ministers get shifted themselves after, you know, maybe 2 years, maybe even less. It's ridiculous. You should have a minimum period of 3 years of ministers to pursue policy, to get implementation, to get real change. Because what they do is, as soon as you walk through the door, it's like a beach, and you know, a wave comes across the beach and it goes out again. It's like you were never there, and they revert then to their kind of standard position. So I do think there's something about the system being totally risk averse. On your second point about pooling risk, I think that's absolutely what we need to do. So that, you know, we've now got, what is it, about 50 councils who've adopted the co-op council model. It would be a great idea for those local authorities to come together and say, in pursuing our cooperative agenda, we are going to do what co-ops do, which is to share risk and mutualise that exposure. And councils can do it because if councils get legal proceedings, then they can have a whip round. They've got legal authority to have a whip round to defend those proceedings together, so they're able to do it. But I thought your point was very, very well made, and we should think further about that. The other issue that I think we should take on board, really, and I suppose my current position is I can say what I like, which is incredibly liberating. But I think we've got to have a bit more of a tougher conversation with our trade union colleagues on this issue, because I don't think we've yet won the argument that social enterprise is not privatisation by the back door, and yet there is a core of people in our movement, and many of whom are worried about their jobs, and legitimately so. As they see services move from the public sector into the social enterprise sector, then they're very concerned. And I've tried to do some work about getting, if you like, a charter that says when things move into the third sector, then there should be guarantees about terms and conditions, union recognition, that kind of thing, to give people some security. Unless we have that dialogue, then we are still going to find resistance from people about having this innovation that you, Gareth, rightly talked about. Because when we come back to government, the situation is not going to be where we were before. We're not going to have massive amounts to spend. We are going to need to be more creative and more collaborative. And I want to take our trade union colleagues with us on that journey. In one of our social enterprises in Salford, we signed the first trade union recognition agreement with Unison, and we agreed these principles about how that would work. And I think, if we could get that more widespread, we'd get the energy of the people who work in the system, because that's where this vibrancy comes from. If people come reluctantly to a new framework, they're not going to give you that energy and 100% commitment that you want. So I would like to see us have really quite an urgent conversation with our trade union colleagues about getting people to agree and to sign up on all of this. I think there will always be statutory services, and we live in a civilised society, I hope, and therefore, when we pay our taxes, we expect that to fund things that make us a civilised society, whether it's education, healthcare, or whatever. I think you can commission it in other ways, and in fact, a guy at a Fringe meeting gave a fabulous example this week where he was doing complex care for people with mental health problems, and they went out to commission it. They got 2 bids back, one from a private organisation and one from a third sector organisation, and they were like neck and neck, these bids, in terms of cost and quality, and they really couldn't decide where they should go. So they got a busload of 20 service users, because it was a residential facility. It was where people were going to spend maybe the rest of their life, and they took the service users round to both places, and they basically said, where would you like to live? And every single one of them said, I want to live in this one. It was provided from a third sector organisation, and that won the contract. So they were looking at it from the opposite end of the kaleidoscope. And if you actually get people themselves to tell you what it is they want, then you'll be on a better track than you determining. Maybe even the best social worker in the world, won't necessarily have the view that the other people will have.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Can I take another round of questions now? The lady at the back there, Caroline, and also the gentleman at the back there as well. Yes.
Hi, my name is Becky Slack, and I'm a freelance journalist, but I've worked a lot in the voluntary sector trade press. Charities are really struggling with the whole issue of payment by results. They're finding it quite crippling, and that's part of the reason I think why they're not either going for or winning a lot of contracts. I'd like to find out what Labour's opinion of payment by results is, and if you get into power in the next election, is that something that you'll be sticking with?
Interesting, thank you. And Caroline?
Another Caroline from ResPublica. My question is also in finance, picking up on what Gareth said earlier with regards to social investment. I'd like to know what the panel thinks about how we can harness social value, given that it's all about local social priorities, in terms of investment and where the future is for new forms of social investment, especially given the cuts and decreased funding of the public sector itself. The interesting thing about the cooperative model is that sort of ordinary people can buy into co-op services and co-op businesses, and I'm wondering if there could be a similar way in which social value can be used for both social and financial returns.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman at the back, please.
Yeah, this is very similar to what I said in the last fringe.
Sorry, I wasn't there, so you'll have to
talking about private and public provision. To me, if I needed a service, I'm much more likely to go to the public one, because I believe that is there primarily to provide a service. Whereas the private one, its bottom line is to make a profit. Right? I mean, it will do anything. It will cut corners. The service users wouldn't be the priority. To make a profit is the priority. Now, Hazel was talking about this third way. I've not heard of this, so I don't know. I mean, me and Hazel, we argue a lot and discuss. Right. But if you do, I mean, people in this room, if you don't think, oh, public can't work, look at the BBC. It's the envy of the world, right? Not for profit. And everybody's jealous. The United States are jealous. The Australians are jealous. Everybody's jealous of the BBC because it's fantastic and it's not for profit. And I think not for profit can work. And the BBC puts its viewers before everything else, rather than ITV who just care about profit.
Can we have your question as well, please?
Well, do you believe that? Does the planner think I'm right that when on the bottom line, if it's a private service, the profit is the motive and rather than the service?
Brilliant. Can I ask the panel to respond, giving you Hazel
Payment by results, will we kind of still go for that model? I think it's got a lot of kind of inherent problems with it, not least the fact that you've got to carry risk. And I think some of the voluntary organisations and smaller, even private sector organisations, struggle. I had a guy in to see me about the work programme who's one of our contractors, and he was saying at the moment it's costing his organisation, and they're not huge, and they come from a voluntary sector background, it's costing them £1 million a month to carry the risk. And he doesn't know how much longer that will be the case. And I actually think that some of these organisations, even the big contractors, are very, very shaky and could well go to the wall. And almost this government, really doesn't care if that happens. So be it. That's the market, and that's it. So I think probably, we will continue with a model whereby you try and get the best value from your investment, and money's going to be really tight. And actually, payment by results can drive performance, but I think you need to be very careful that you're not putting a burden on people where the risk is so great that they're not going to be able to deliver that. So maybe there needs to be a bit more careful calibration about it. But in principle, I certainly have no objection to saying, I'm spending public money on this service, and I want to get the very best efficiency out of that public money that I possibly can. But I'm a bit worried about the situation at the moment. In terms of social investment, then obviously the work that Gareth is doing on the Community Reinvestment Act and the stuff, the models from America, I think is absolutely fantastic. And what was very interesting is that in the areas where they had community reinvestment in the States, in fact, they did not see the effect of the kind of banking crisis that we saw in lots of other areas, because the decisions were local, the lending decisions were far less risky, and it's the same issue with credit unions. If you have a credit union, you look at the default rate in a credit union, it's tiny, because people are actually borrowing their friends' and neighbours' money, and there's much more incentive for you to pay that back than if you're borrowing Bob Diamond's money. I think all of those models where you have a connection between the community and the financial institution that you're funding are absolutely the direction that we should go in. We had a Salford money line, and it was, I think, slightly, in a way, an improvement on a credit union. You didn't have to have a deposit balance, and you could get a loan for transport to work, you could get a loan for a new outfit to go to your first job, you could get a loan for your washer when your washer broke down. And again, even though you didn't have a deposit in the account, the default rate was tiny. Maybe people worried about somebody from Salford turning up on your doorstep saying you owe me the money, but that was better than the loan sharks who'd be on your doorstep anyway. So we should do much, much more of that. And in terms of private and public level, we don't argue, we discuss in our constituency, don't we?
That's what I meant.
I think the issue really is about how you commission, what you set out you want to see happen. Because I think we should be smarter, and if we are going to have people from the private sector and the voluntary sector bid to us, it's our responsibility when we're spending public money to say what we want out of it. And I just think it's a no-brainer to say if we're spending public money, then it's not just about profit, you have to do public good as well as the jobs that you're there to do. So you're not just there just to build the house like anybody else could, bogus or whatever, just for profit. You're there to do exactly as Tom said, that in the process of building that house or of doing your repairs, you employ some local apprentices and you're changing their lives as well. And I think it brings me back to the first point about confidence. We are spending the public's money here, and therefore we should be just as rigorous, whether it's about payment by results, whether it's about commissioning what we want, or whether it's about saying, you're getting public money, that's great, I don't mind if you make a profit, if you're efficient, but I'm absolutely sure you have to put some public good in there as well.
Thank you. And Joe, do you want to respond to this question?
Okay, I won't repeat things that Hazel said, but I'll perhaps go another way. Going towards out now.
No, Joe, he'll be back.
No. Let me just say this one. We should probably do a fringe on the work programme, because I'm so angry about the work programme, I could go on for hours about it, so I won't do that. But just to say that the work programme was done in such a way that ministers said that 40% of the helping people find work, which we all want to do, we all want to help people back to work, 40% of that would be done by local community groups, that's what they said. Yeah. And then they said, they decided to break it up into 20 massive contracts and ask for millions of pounds on the table as collateral, so no charity could go anywhere near it. So you get A4Es winning the contracts, saying they're going to take on St Mungo's and others, and getting them to spend money, right, prepared to take them on, and then not using them. Because in fact, you know, my fear is that people who are hard to place in the labour market, they signed up for this at a time when unemployment was lower and it was easier to place people. It's got a bit harder now. So if you're going to get a premium for that person, you weigh up how much I'm going to spend to get that hard to place person to work. And I think they're just parking a lot of those people. They're sending them down to our volunteer centres and all sorts of stuff. Terrible. So don't get me started on that. But it was a terrible way to do it. Massive big contracts, that's the thing. I think I'm not against payment by results. I'm not against social impact bonds or social investment. But I do worry that people think, right, that's a great idea, we got it from America, so that's what we're going to do everywhere, and in every case. So we've got to just use it judiciously. Where you run into problems is where you over-specify, it becomes that. Here's a question. So people today, I don't know if you saw, but the West Coast Main Line contract, which was going to be taken away from Virgin and given to First Group, they've retracted that. But just a little piece of information that came out of that. The government said on their own calculation they're going to hand back £40 million to the contractors, which they spent preparing the bids, without any penny of money being spent on providing a railway service to us. £40 million just on the paraphernalia of the contracts. So, and they probably end up paying more because that's just the government estimate. Now, you know, we're talking about sometimes contracts of, you know, £200,000, £100,000, £50,000, sometimes much smaller than that. And so local council thinking, we have to get, we have this big contracting thing, have pre-qualification, get into European journals for some very small amounts. So I think there's got to be a mix, and you've got to use the right thing for the right place. And the National Audit Office agree with me on this. Sometimes giving a grant, getting people to say, this is what we'll do, specifying what you want from it is a better idea. But there is a place for all the rest of it. And social impact bonds in particular, or social investment, here's the problem why a lot of charities and voluntary groups find it difficult to partake in, is if you're asking for people to commit to what's going to be the result in 20 years, which in social impact bonds we're doing, many charities don't know if they're going to exist in 20 years. They don't have an income stream, probably housing associations do. So it's good for some people, but it just can't be applied to everyone. So I just think you need to use the right mechanism for the right case. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Joe. Gareth, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to pick up a couple of things. There is a local authority looking at using its buying power in terms of energy with the energy company buys to get a better deal for those people living in its area in terms of their energy prices, the energy prices they have to pay. Now, that seems to me a classic example of a local authority using a contract and delivering social value in their community. So using the best of the private sector to provide the energy, using their buying power as a public services provider, and delivering a benefit for the third sector. So I think the choice between private good, private bad, and public good is a false choice, and that's where I think the debate about payment by results is very interesting, because if you take put to one side the work programme and the other payment by results models that we know, and actually think about the philosophy behind payment by results, actually it seems to me that as a philosophy it's a perfectly reasonable thing for us as a party to want to champion. You do want the public sector to deliver really good results, and you do want the public sector to be continuing to champion even better results going forward, and also demanding that the private sector that it contracts with delivers positive results too. Hazel and Joe are absolutely right, it seems to me. There are real problems with the way the most well-known payment by results models are working at the moment in terms of the work programme, and we will need to learn the lessons from that approach if we're going to continue to use this model going forward. There are a series of types of social investment, of which payment by results is one, social impact bonds, a version of that, the Community Reinvestment Act model from the US, another form of social investment. So we need to be looking at what works for different organisations at different times. And that work, I think, is hugely important. We simply are not going to have, as a government next time round, the sort of resources available to put into the voluntary and community sector that we did have between 1997 and 2010. And that is going to be a huge challenge for the sector as a result. And the work we're trying to do now, I think, is particularly crucial in that sense going forward.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please do check out our website, ResPublica.org.uk, for all of the tweets and the work on social value and public services. And thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you especially for supporting this event. Thank you.